In the previous video, we discussed the concepts of consumer surplus and producer surplus. Consumer surplus is the difference between a consumer's highest willingness to pay for a good or a service and the price they actually have to pay. In other words, it's the happiness, the extra happiness or value that they leave with at the end of a transaction or a trade. Producer surplus is the difference between the producer's lowest willingness to sell and the price at which they actually sell. In other words, it's the happiness or value that a producer leaves a transaction with that they didn't come with, right? So the additional happiness or value that's created in a trade. And economists use these concepts which added together equal social welfare, the welfare created within a market or an economy. They use this concept to define market efficiency. So total surplus is the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus. This tells us all of the gains from trade in a market. Right? So we add the gain to the consumer plus the gain to the producer, and it gives us the total gain from trade within a market, the total surplus in a market. And we'll show on the next slide how total surplus, total gains from trade are maximized in a market without government intervention. When the market is allowed to move to the market clearing price, that equilibrium point where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. That is where total surplus is maximized. And we call that point, that outcome, we call that efficient. This is how we measure efficiency in a market. One of the ways. There's another way that's actually equivalent to this, which we'll discuss in a future chapter. But an outcome is efficient. A market is allocating resources efficiently when the allocation of resources maximizes total surplus. Notice, this does not say maximizes consumer surplus or maximizes producer surplus. When we're discussing market efficiency, the economist is not concerned with which side of the market receives surplus, more or less of the surplus. Right? What we're concerned with is that all the surplus that can be had, all the happiness that can be had in this market is being had. Nothing is left on the table that could have been gained from trade that we're not allowing to happen, right? So an outcome is efficient regardless of who receives, regardless of how the surplus is split up between consumer and producer, as long as that surplus is maximized, we call this outcome efficient. Now, with this slide, the goal is to show that that maximum surplus occurs at the market equilibrium price and quantity. So in this particular picture, we've got a market for slices of coconut cream pie. The market equilibrium price is $4 and equilibrium quantity is 6 million slices, right? So that's where supply and demand meet. It's where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. And in this case, pause the slide and use your knowledge from the previous video to mark out on a graph, so draw a graph for yourself, like this one of supply and demand, and mark out where consumer surplus and producer surplus are on this graph if the price is $4 and quantity is sold is 6 million. So remember that consumer surplus is the difference between consumers' highest willingness to pay and the price they actually have to pay, right? So the price that's actually paid in this market is the market price, $4. So that's one boundary. what is the consumer's highest willingness to pay? Remember, in the previous video, we defined demand and supply in this way. Demand is the consumer's highest willingness to pay. Supply is the producer's lowest willingness to sell. Given those definitions of demand and supply, it becomes clear that the consumer's highest willingness to pay is the demand curve. And so, this triangle represents consumer surplus. You can think about the demand curve as being the highest willingness to pay of lots of different little consumers, right? If we plot, one consumer really loves coconut cream pie, is willing to pay a bunch for it. The next guy is not quite willing to pay as much, right? If we plot all those consumers' willingness to pay, then we end up with the demand curve. And so if there's a consumer at point A who's willing to pay $7 for a slice of pie, how much surplus does that consumer get? The answer is the space between $4 and $7. They get this much surplus. The consumer at point B, who's only willing to pay $5 for a slice of pie, gets this much surplus. The difference between $4 and $5, right? And if we did that for every consumer along this demand curve, if we think about the demand curve as being lots of little consumers, then we would end up coloring in this triangle, right? And you can actually find the dollars and cents amount of consumer surplus by finding the area of this triangle. Remember, area of the triangle is 1/2 the base. So the base in this case is 6 million, right? How long is this side of the triangle? It's the quantity, all the way up to the quantity, and times the height. The height in this case would be whatever that price is. It's not labeled on this graph, so we may not be able to find it here. The base times the height and divided by 2. And that would give you the actual amount of consumer surplus in this market. Where's the producer surplus? Well, remember, producer surplus is the difference between producer's lowest willingness to accept for a good or service, in this case for coconut cream pie, and the price they actually receive. In this case, the price is $4. So the price that's received by the producer is $4, which is the same as the price that's paid by the consumer. And where is the producer's lowest willingness to accept, or lowest willingness to sell? It's the supply curve, right? So this triangle between the price actually paid and the supply curve gives us our total producer surplus in the market. And again, you can, just like we did on the consumer side, you can think about the supply curve as being a bunch of little suppliers graphed along here and their lowest willingness to accept. And you can think about how much producer surplus does this guy get, and then that guy, and then that guy, and then that guy. And if you fill them all in, then you would get this area of this triangle, the red triangle. So what is the total surplus in this market? What is the total welfare in this market? The answer is you take this area and add it to that area, and you have all of this surplus, right? So I told you at the beginning of this slide that my goal was to show that this is the efficient outcome for a market. This allowing a market to do what the market does and go to or find out this equilibrium price and quantity was when we're at that equilibrium price and quantity, where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded, is where the market is efficient. This is where we have maximized surplus. So, what is my argument for that? Think about if we tried to sell more pie than 6 million slices, right? So right now we're stopping right here at 6 million slices of pie. That's where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. What if we tried to sell more pie? What would happen to surplus? In fact, if we moved anywhere to the right of this market equilibrium, we would be causing sadness in the market, not creating happiness, right? On this side of the market, why have we created surplus? Why have we created happiness? The answer is because there is space between the price that's paid and the willingness to pay. There's space between the price that's received and the willingness to sell, right? So over here, there are consumers, if we think about the demand curve as being the highest willingness to pay and the supply curve the lowest willingness to accept, there are consumers willing to pay a price higher than the producer's lowest willingness to accept. We can find a pair of consumer and producer who are willing to trade with one another because there's a consumer out there willing to buy at a price higher than a producer's willing to sell for, right? So over here, we create happiness with trade because we create this surplus, this space between the price paid and what the producer or consumer was willing to do. On this side of the equilibrium, it's the opposite. On this side of the equilibrium, the lowest willingness to accept by suppliers is higher than the highest willingness to pay by demanders, which means in order to have any transactions over here, we would be forcing people to do something they don't want to do. We'd be forcing a consumer to pay a higher price than they wanted to, or forcing a supplier to accept a lower price than they wanted to, thereby creating negative surplus. We'd be subtracting surplus from the market if we forced more transactions. So we certainly don't want to go anywhere to the right of that equilibrium point. What about going to the left? What if we stopped before we got to 6 million slices of pie sold? If we said, okay, stop, and we stopped trade, and we didn't allow anyone else to trade, what would that do? We would lose some amount of surplus that could have been gained if we had allowed trade to continue, right? So if we stopped trade right here at this dotted line, then we're going to forfeit all of this surplus in this triangle because we're not allowing transactions to happen. And where there is no transaction, there is no surplus. The transactions are where the surplus is created. And so if we stop transactions short, then we lose out on some of this surplus that we could have gained if we had allowed trade to continue, because there's still, in this area, there still are consumers willing to pay a price higher than the lowest willingness to accept by a producer. We still could find those matches between consumer and producer who are willing to come to an agreement and purchase. So the bottom line, the point here is that the maximum amount of surplus occurs when the market is at this equilibrium quantity and price, right? So we don't want to go further to the right, and we don't want to go further to the left. Either way, this way we're stopping short of all the happiness we could have, and this way we're forcing transactions that people didn't want, and so we're creating sadness in a sense. So by this argument, the market is efficient when the market is allowed to go to its equilibrium. In other words, when the market is not interfered with by government or some outside force. When the market does what the market does by its invisible hand. Remember, that market always is moving toward the market equilibrium if we just let people behave in their own self-interest and don't interfere with the market. It's always moving toward that happy place of efficiency.